And we ended up the next year going on a year-long public speaking tour. I was a Unitarian Universalist minister, and so I hooked us up in churches, and we spoke at 25 congregations, both Unitarian Universalist and United Church of Christ. We had a Living with Dementia sermon, and many of the churches, we also held a workshop, either on the Saturday before the Sunday or after church. And Sky just loved it. He wanted to meet his people. He wanted to meet other people with dementia. And by doing this church stuff and the workshops, it was his people all over the place. And in many congregations, there would be somebody who came out who had not told anybody that they had dementia.
Right.
And became public about it.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Alz Authors Podcast. We're so glad you found us. We're the global community of authors writing about Alzheimer's and dementia from personal experience to light the way for others. I'm Mary Ann Shuko, a registered nurse, author, and dementia daughter.
And I'm Christy Byrne-Yates, a licensed educational psychologist, dementia daughter, Alz author, and coach focused on the sandwich generation. Please join us for bi-weekly episodes with our authors as we talk about their dementia journeys, sharing intimate details and painfully obtained knowledge to help others currently on that path.
We hope these stories offer you comfort and support as we strive to break the silence and stigma surrounding a dementia diagnosis.
May one of our authors speak to your experience.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
Hi, I'm Susan of Alz Authors. When I was a caregiver for my mother with dementia, resources to educate and offer support were hard to come by. Alz Authors believes in the power of storytelling to support and encourage those impacted by Alzheimer's and dementia. Custom Caregiver Collections is a customized collection of memoirs, novels, caregiver guides, children's books, and more. This collection of well-vetted books comes displayed in a beautifully crafted wooden tabletop bookshelf with Alz Authors branding. Custom Caregiver Collections supports our goal of bringing real books to real people in real places and are perfectly suited for senior care communities, senior centers, doctors' offices, memory cafes, and professional or personal libraries. If you or your organization is interested in ordering or building a custom caregiver collection, we can guide you through choices of books written in many categories to support your needs. Want to build your own book collection? Contact us at alzauthors.com/ccc to get started.
Hi, Marianne. How you doing?
Good, Christy. How are you today?
I am good. I am excited to talk to Jane Dwinell, our author today, and with her husband, Sky Yardley. They wrote a book called Alzheimer's Canyon, and it's fascinating. Sky did a lot of the writing, a lot of blogs, but it is their story of his discovery of his Alzheimer's at a fairly young age, and some of the ways in which he experienced Alzheimer's. And then Jane added in a lot of parts, too, about how the effect on her as a caregiver. It's a fascinating read, and they're a fascinating couple.
Yes, I enjoyed the way that they their solution to their problem was to share their story and to travel. They traveled all over the United States talking about Alzheimer's and meeting with people with dementia and caregivers and sharing their story. And Jane was a Unitarian Universalist minister. And so that was their audience. They traveled to different churches throughout the country and did workshops. And Sky was not shy about sharing his dilemmas and his celebrations and his achievements in spite of dementia. And he was a pretty funny guy from what we read.
Yeah.
And another interesting thing is he went into memory care right at the start of the pandemic.
Right.
So she tells us all about that. And
well, they just did a lot of fascinating things in their life to begin with. Travel, and he's fluent in French, and they spent time in France. They retired early to do a lot of philanthropic kinds of work, and were in New Orleans after Katrina, helping to build houses. I mean, that's just incredibly fascinating. And so, and hearing about Sky from Jane, I mean, he just sounds like a fascinating man, and with a sense of humor and with a lot of insight into what was happening for him. But it's funny, and it's sad and tender, and I think it'll be an interesting conversation.
Yes, I think the listeners will really enjoy it.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get to it.
Let's get started. Hi, Jane. Welcome to the All Authors podcast. How are you today?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Hi. I'm so delighted to meet you and really excited to hear what you have to tell us today and tell us about your story. Yeah.
So your book, Alzheimer's Canyon, was started with your husband, and he was journaling and blogging about his journey, correct?
Right. Yeah. After his diagnosis, he embraced his dementia diagnosis, unlike many people. And the first thing he did was research. He went to our library and read every book they had about dementia, ordered many more. And he particularly wanted to read books written by people with dementia, which, as you both know, are few and far between. And he started writing. And he was not a writer. He was a smart guy. He'd gone to Amherst, but he turned his back on all that academic stuff. And in fact, when he started writing for the blog, he struggled. And I'd have to say, Sky, you're not at Amherst. just write. Like, nobody's going to judge you, for your sentence structure. And he just relished writing. He said it helped him make sense of what was going on in his life. And he also wanted to do what he could to erase the stigma around dementia, which is why the writing turned into a blog. And he just looked forward to writing and looked forward to people's responses. He just completely embraced it.
I love that. And I'll bet a lot of that was just how to process. Sometimes when we write things out, we can make more sense of it ourselves. So what a great strategy. But then what a giving heart to want to share it with other people to reduce stigma. That's great. I wanted to ask you, first of all, I also wanted to acknowledge you recently won an award for this book in New England.
Know.
So
it's exciting. Yes, the Independent Publishers of New England named Alzheimer's Canyon the best narrative nonfiction book of 2023.
Oh my gosh, fantastic. Wonderful. That is really, what a great accolade after all of this, and to have that recognition. So congratulations on that. That's really terrific.
Absolutely. That's like the cherry on top, right?
Yeah. No, it was completely unexpected. The woman kept emailing me and saying, "Are you prepared to speak?" And I'm like, yeah, I can do that. And I kept saying to myself, she's only asking me if I'm ready to speak if I'm going to win something.
Wow.
Yeah, no, it was great. It was a nice little ceremony on Zoom.
Really cool. Really cool.
So what do you think Sky would say about that?
Oh my God. Well, as a friend of mine, when I posted it on my Facebook, she commented, I forget exactly how she phrased it, but Sky was a very sort of shy, self-effacing man. And part of him would be embarrassed by all of this, and part of him would be delighted. But he said that somewhere in one of his writings about that he wasn't known for tooting his own horn, which is true.
Yeah, that's interesting.
That's
it's really cool.
Yeah, can you just go back a little bit and tell us about what happened? When did you start noticing that maybe he was having some signs of memory impairment, or was he the one who figured it out? How did that go? What was your journey like getting a diagnosis?
Well, that was interesting, as I suppose it is for most people. My first career was as a nurse, and I worked the two ends of life, childbirth and then hospice and nursing home work. And I had worked in a memory care facility when people were first starting to do that, the late 80s, early 90s. So I was familiar with dementia. And, Sky was also a very laid back guy and forgetful already. He was just one of those people that kind of moved through the world at a casual pace. And so actually he first was concerned. And this was about 4 years before his diagnosis. And he went online and found one of those, cognitive tests, which he scored perfectly on. And, he decided to maybe not worry about it. He was already perfectly healthy, nothing wrong, no family history.
Sure.
We did all the right exercise, eating, blah, blah, blah. He even created crossword puzzles for our local newspaper. So, he was a smart guy. And it wasn't until a year before his diagnosis that I noticed that he had lost his spatial abilities. And this is a guy, when I met him, he was a produce truck driver. I owned a restaurant, and he delivered my produce on Thursday afternoons. And he could back that truck into like anywhere. And we had a boat in France, and he could do anything with the boat. And then all of a sudden he couldn't. We were actually in France on the boat, and he was having a hard time getting into locks and tying up the boat. And that just seemed weird since he had such good spatial ability. And once we got back to the States, we were meeting our kids. We had rented a condo in South Carolina for the holidays, and we were meeting our kids there. And so we were driving in an unfamiliar place, but he kept yelling at me when I was driving that I was going in the wrong direction. And I was like, this is a guy who had a perfect sense of direction. It was like really weird. And then our daughter bought a condo, and we were helping her. I was painting, and she and Sky were ripping up carpeting and laying hardwood flooring. And I could hear Dana yelling at Sky in the other room, Sky, that's not how you lay flooring. And Sky and I at that point had built 6 houses. Wow. And we had gone to New Orleans to volunteer after Katrina because we had house building and house renovation skills. And I was like, how could Sky not know how to lay flooring? But see, it was a real spatial thing. Like he wasn't getting the breaks, how to run the saw and all that kind of stuff. And so that's when we started suggesting maybe there was something wrong and he should get tested. And he avoided that, like people do. He didn't really want to think anything was wrong. And it wasn't until we were renovating our new house. We bought a duplex with our son and his partner in Burlington, Vermont. And it was a complete gut down to the studs and renovation. And Sky realized he couldn't do the carpentry work. That he would take a measurement, he would have a piece of paper, so he'd write it down. He didn't trust himself to remember. But because he'd lost the spatial ability, he didn't know how to cut a straight line with a circular saw or how to put the lumber up to have it fit for door trim, And that's when he said, okay, we got to do something about this. And he agreed to be tested, which was a big process.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I don't know what happens in other places, but in Vermont, it was required. And we'd been in New Orleans, so we just moved to Burlington. We didn't have a doctor or anything. You were required to go to a doctor to have the initial screening and blood tests and blah, blah, blah. And then the MRI, and then the PET scan. And the University of Vermont Medical Center has a memory clinic. And Sky called to make an appointment, and this is when he found out about the doctor thing. And they were like, this was summer. He said, and they said, well, our next available appointment is in January. And I thought, oh my God, I'm going to go nuts. And the woman called back 5 minutes later and said, somebody has just canceled for next week, which was really lucky.
That's
so,
great, yeah.
We had a diagnosis within 4 weeks of his different appointments.
Wow.
So,
but that is a process. But so first he was reluctant, but then once he received the diagnosis, where did that take him?
Well, initially into devastation.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah.
And we had completely coincidentally, had a long planned trip to France the day after his diagnosis. It actually was really nice. It was when we were doing this renovation thing, and that's when the sheetrockers were going to come. And they said, you can't be here for 2 weeks. And we thought, oh, we can go to France.
Yeah.
So, we spent 2 weeks walking the streets of Paris and talking and crying, and he couldn't read a map. He couldn't figure out how to use his metro ticket, but he was fluent in French. His French was impeccable. When we go into a store or a restaurant, the brain is such a mysterious thing.
It's so interesting. Yeah, it's so interesting.
Yeah. So in a way, that was a nice break, and it was just the two of us. Our adult kids were obviously processing, that was the first people he called, and his sister and, stuff. So it was a nice break. And that's, by the time we got home, he's like, I'm ready to roll. Let's do this.
Wow. That's.
And we ended up the next year going on a year-long public speaking tour. I was a Unitarian Universalist minister, and so I hooked us up in churches, and we spoke at 25 congregations, both Unitarian Universalist and United Church of Christ. We had a Living with Dementia sermon, and many of the churches, we also held a workshop, either on the Saturday before the Sunday or after church. And Sky just loved it. He wanted to meet his people. He wanted to meet other people with dementia. And by doing this church stuff and the workshops, it was his people all over the place. And in many congregations, there would be somebody who came out who had not told anybody that they had dementia.
Right.
And became public about it.
Yeah. So it's so interesting how different things kind of happen, right? And I read that you and Sky had retired early, and you were doing a lot of these different things, and so it sort of gave you the freedom to be able to and really, I just want to say you both are such givers, and you were building things for people, and then going down to New Orleans. I mean, that really touches my heart. I think that's so wonderful. And so, then he was age 66 when he was formally diagnosed, correct? Right. So still really young. And, but you had this freedom to be able to process it a little bit differently than maybe someone who has to think about leaving work or, changing everything else. So it's such an interesting way that this kind of evolved for you both. Yeah. Oh,
it was such a gift that we retired early. We hadn't really planned on it, but it was in the back of our minds. And Sky professionally was a family mediator, and also in Vermont did a thing like mediation called parent coordination, but it's not mediation because high conflict families aren't allowed to mediate anyway. And he just turned to me one day. He said, I'm really sick of all these people in conflict. I'd really rather do something else.
Yeah.
He had a very successful practice, but, he was like, I'm done.
Yeah, sure.
Enough of this.
I get it.
And coincidentally, that it was not long. It was like a year, after Katrina.
Yeah.
And, and we're not city people, we're country people. And he was like, let's go to New Orleans and volunteer. And I thought, well, sure, why not? We loaded our car with all our carpentry tools and an air mattress, and off we went. Yeah. And we had a fabulous time. We met such amazing people. We loved the culture of the city, and it surprised both of us.
Yeah. So you get this diagnosis, you'd go on this, what did you say, a year-long venture of going out to different churches and talking and and sharing things, and how was it for both of you with his disease progression? Were you seeing that progressing along the way, and did you know when to, or how did you come to know, well, it's time to come back somewhere? And
it was a lovely coincidence. We had the engagements from September to September, and when he got to that last one, I knew he couldn't do it anymore. He was reading his sermon, and I was reading mine, but he was he was starting to be scared, and luckily, the last one was a local one to us. The last couple that summer were local because, we traveled all the way to the West Coast for a lot of it. Most of it was New England or New Jersey. And, we hooked it up with the bucket list. We had done so much traveling. He had only one thing left on his bucket list, which was to go skiing out west. He was a black diamond skier, amazing athlete. And I'm like, okay, we'll go. And then I was like, oh my God, we're in this condo that looks like 300 other condos. Is he going to find his way home? Because, I could ski, but, there was no keeping up with him. That's for sure. He didn't get lost once. Wow. It was amazing. Though he said to me, I learned right away to ride up the chairlift with somebody else and kind of follow them. Because it's a brand new mountain. He'd never been. It was really big.
Yeah. Good strategy.
We had a great time. And, his greatest challenge anywhere we were was where was the bathroom in the middle of the night? Because, of course, that was a different location everywhere we were. But, otherwise he did great.
Yeah, I find that really, that's very an interesting because the common advice is to not move people who have dementia because it creates more problems. And we have one other author in our organization, Tony Copeland Parker, who he and his wife were his partner. They were marathoners. They ran all over the world, and they're still running. Now they're in assisted living, but they still occasionally run. But they've been in almost every country on earth. He just takes her. And she wants to go, and they fly, and they stay for weeks at a time. And he said, people told me I wasn't doing the right thing, but we were happy. They had made such great memories. So, and I know people who were afraid to travel with their spouse if they have dementia. And it does have its challenges, but it's not impossible.
No, not at all. And we were lucky that we had done so much traveling before. And so we knew how to travel together. And, I did have to pick up a lot of the travel tasks that he did. I had to go get the train tickets or the, plane tickets that he had always handled, that kind of thing. But that was fine, And it was mostly me. I think I was more worried about it than he was.
Sure.
Because I didn't want him to get lost. Part of one of the trips was we were in New Orleans visiting friends, and he said, I'm going to go out for a walk. And I'm like, oh, please come back. And he did, And he wasn't shy about asking for help. That's the other thing. Yeah,
like, that's great. That's great. Well, what you're saying makes, I think you speak to a lot of caregivers' anxieties when you say that, right? Sometimes the person who has the dementia might be unaware of the anxiety. It manifests so differently in everybody, but then there's the caregiver who's like thinking of all the things that could go wrong, right? So that's a lot on you. Yeah.
Right. And I wanted him to have his freedom as long as he could. I didn't want to start telling him he couldn't do stuff.
Right. I mean, there's that other challenge then as a caregiver is freedom, and then also just dignity. What do we do while we're watching the person we care about stumble through things and make sure that we preserve as much of their dignity as we possibly can, kind of looking at, what do we do? So.
Right. I was incredibly fortunate that he was the person that he was willing to talk about stuff. And one of the early conversations we had was about driving.
Wow.
And how would we know it was time for him to stop driving? And it was his choice. He said, "This is too frightening. I am not doing this anymore."
Okay. That's great.
Yeah.
Because that is a tough conversation.
Yeah. Especially since he had been a professional truck driver. I mean, this guy was like into driving. He wrote a beautiful piece about it that's in the book, just remembering the thrill of getting his license as a teenager and realizing like he could go anywhere. And he'd always traditionally been the driver when we went on long trips. And partly that he always got car sick. So he had to be the driver so he didn't get car sick.
Right.
So anyway, he was very gracious about, letting me drive on long trips. And then once he was, he just took up driving in town and then came home once and said, "That's it, I'm done."
Yeah.
My stepfather was like that too. He said to me, "I don't want to drive. Margie makes me drive." Margie was my mother. So my mother never drove. So it was a problem for her now because then neither of them were driving. But every once in a while he'd want to drive or he'd say, "Where's my car?" But my brother had disabled it. So he couldn't start it. And we would say to him, "Oh, it's okay." And then when he was in the nursing home, we would tell him, "Oh, it's at home. It's at home. It's okay. No one's using it. It's at home. It's waiting for you." And he would be satisfied with that. But I was so relieved when he didn't want to drive anymore. I was waiting for a huge eruption.
It is so nice when it's their choice. But then there are those other ways around it. Jane, I wanted to also then talk about what came next. You had at some point needed to put Sky chose, or you guys decided for him to go into a care facility, and then wow, everything changed, right? Then we entered a whole new world. So
right, for all of us.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about how that decision came about, that between the two of you, for him to take some time into a facility.
Well, part of his early research about dementia was visiting our local memory care facility and having a tour and finding out the outrageous amount of money that it cost. He was very frugal, and he was like, "Oh my God." But I knew what it cost, and I'd started saving money as soon. I opened a special savings account to start saving money in case that day came. But I thought, I'm the nurse. I can handle this. We're going to do this to the end. I'm not afraid of diapers and whatever. Well, what happened was we didn't know he had Lewy body dementia until after he died and had an autopsy, but he started hallucinating all the time, 24 hours a day. And his hallucinations were benign. I mean, actually, a lot of them were amazing. I loved, the trees had names. He was talking to trees. There were elves that lived on the roof. And, it's pretty incredible. But, he'd wake me up in the middle of the night to tell me about this.
Yeah.
I wouldn't go back to sleep, and he'd go right back to sleep. And I was getting exhausted. My whole body broke out in hives. Oh my God, I was a complete wreck. Itchy. And I had been able to go away some, like a weekend now and then. And we were in this duplex with our son and his partner. And so they would look after Sky. And I finally said, I think I can't do this anymore. And my son, we also had a daughter who lived near, like an hour away. And so the three of us talked about it, me and the two kids, about whether Sky should go to a memory care facility. Well, our local facility offered a respite program where you could stay for 2 weeks to 2 months. And, that seemed like a good idea. So Sky and I went on a tour, and he loved it. His people were there.
Yeah.
And we had also had a break-in a couple of months before, 2-3 months before. And, I think that scared him. I think he realized he would feel safe at the memory care facility. And my son was still kind of against this because he was in the, we can take care of Sky thing. And he told me to go away for 3 days to our camp, which is where I am now. And he would take care of Sky, and we could all think about it. And I got back, and he said, I didn't realize that taking care of Sky would mean that I wouldn't get to sleep.
Oh.
And that was, I said, yep, this is what we've been doing. And he was like, okay, let's do this. 2 weeks. And I had visions of tropical beaches and tropical drinks and reading novels and sleeping. And, after 2 weeks, I'd be revived and it'd be fine. I'd take care of Sky. And I placed him on March 10th, 2020. And the next week was the lockdown.
Wow.
And I didn't get to see him for 5 months.
So he was there on respite.
Right.
You couldn't take him out from respite. Wow.
Take him out. If I took him out, he was not going to be allowed to go back in.
Right.
And he had the facility had their own doctor, and she was fabulous. The staff was fabulous, and he was up all night with hallucinations, and he was peeing wherever he felt like peeing and sleeping wherever he felt like sleeping. And they tried all kinds of medications to help him sleep with no luck. And that's when I realized, after the 2 months when I would theoretically have to take him out, I'm like, he's staying with you until this is all over.
Yeah. Wow, that's just had to be so hard to start to, first of all, that shock of, I can't get him back.
Right. No, I couldn't, and then take him out for a drive and when we had visited, one of the things that I really liked was watching the family members. They were coming in to feed people lunch or walk with them or whatever. And I was, they said for respite, don't come. It's harder for everybody. Just go away for the 2 weeks and then come back. But then I realized with the lockdown, the staff lost all those family members, who were helping. And they had to do it all themselves.
Mm-hmm. So can you tell us a little bit about, because you couldn't go into the facility, how did you make contact? How did you find out how he was doing? We saw pictures throughout the pandemic of people going up to windows and saying hello, and I know there was Zoom, but Zoom's hard when you have dementia, right? I mean, and then
exactly.
And are the staff around to do it? So can you talk to us a little bit about what you did?
Well, of course, all of us were in this, what's happening in the world thing. The whole place was a mess. And Sarah and Emma and I, with the lockdown, decided to move to camp because we thought if we can't go anywhere, we might as well be on the lake, and it's beautiful. And by then it's going to be spring. And, so the three of us abandoned our duplex in Burlington and moved to camp. And of course, then all of a sudden I'm living with my adult child and his partner. So that's like a new thing too. And Sky would call. I would call sometimes, but, in his hallucinatory world, sometimes he was too busy to talk to me.
Yeah.
So what I said to the staff was just have him call me when he wants to call me. And, we talked on the phone at least once a week, sometimes twice a week. And he called in whatever current hallucination he was in. And he was usually traveling, and he wanted to tell me where he was and what he was doing and when he'd be home. And, I played along with it. And sometimes he'd talk to me for a minute, and sometimes he'd talk to me for 20 minutes. Like, I didn't ever know. And he never once asked to come home. Never.
Wow.
Which is,
okay.
Thank God for that. That would have just I had a friend whose husband went into care about the same time. And every time it was one of those where she could come to the window thing.
Mm-hmm.
I was an hour away. So, I wasn't going to do that. Every time he asked, well, why am I here? Why can't I go home? Anyway, that was a blessing. After 5 months, the governor lifted the ban on people going to senior facilities, and they allowed a visit for a half an hour once a week outside, 6 feet apart, masked and gowned.
Mm-hmm.
And try that with somebody with dementia and see how that goes.
Wow.
Not great. And at that point, Sky physically couldn't hold his head up anymore. So he couldn't even see me.
Yeah.
He could hear me, but he couldn't see me. And even if I sat on the ground, the staff was right there. They were keeping the 6 foot apart thing. They were being strict about it. And even if I sat on the ground, he still couldn't see me. And every week I'd say, am I going to do this again? Because it was really painful. It was really, really painful.
Yeah.
And then I was like, yeah, I'm going to do it again. And then by fall, it was another lockdown.
Oh, yeah. Just revolving lockdowns, right? Yeah.
Revolving lockdowns. And it wasn't until the last week of his life that, they were good about having, like a Zoom thing for family members. And I forget I think it was only once a month. I don't think it was once a week. And we were on this Zoom call, and they mentioned that people were allowed compassionate care visits, if their person was dying or not doing well. And Sky had, it wasn't that he had fallen, but the doctor had called me and said he couldn't bear weight, that he would try to stand and collapse. And she was afraid he had broken his hip. He was a very slender guy, and, had x-rays done, no broken hip. Because I was like, oh man, broken hip. Like,
right.
My mother had a broken hip, and I had to deal with that, and she didn't even have dementia. Anyway, the doctor said to me an interesting thing. She said sometimes people with dementia lose their ability to understand where they are in space, mm-hmm. which certainly made sense with Sky's spatial awareness mm-hmm. issue, and that's why he couldn't stand.
Yeah.
So they allowed me a compassionate care visit, and within 2 days, he couldn't swallow, and 3 days after that, he was dead. Wow. But I was allowed to be there the last 3 days.
Wow.
And they were great. They brought in a cot. They brought me meals. The staff members came in and told stories. They loved him. They completely loved him. And he was so happy there. He was so happy there that's what made it okay.
Yeah, yeah.
How long was it since, the time of his diagnosis till he passed?
4.5 years.
It's quick.
And he was in the facility for almost a year, just shy of a year.
So just a little over 70, right? I mean, he was young. He was young.
Yeah. And the doctor, the neurologist said, no, you have to be under 60 for it to be young.
Oh, okay.
Well, he had it before, for years before
Probably,
that.
Yeah.
Exactly. So did he have any disorientation with like the masking, and did he know it was you when you were there by your voice?
He knew me till the end.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay.
Which is amazing to me.
Yeah.
When I went for the compassionate care visit, he was in a wheelchair, and he was pretty out of it. And then I forget, like I was talking to him because I was like, my God, I'm finally in his physical presence. I'm touching him, whatever. And he kind of came to, and I don't know what I had said. And he looked at me and he said, Jane, you always think you're right. And I'm like, yeah, but he still knows who I am.
That's great.
And the last thing he said to me, he told me I was beautiful.
Oh, Jane, that's lovely.
So you mentioned that there was an autopsy. Was that was at your request?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I don't think we've talked about that before in the podcast.
Yeah, I had that question also. Is that common or not common? Or
well, the doctor, this fabulous doctor, approached me and said, would you like to do an autopsy? And I said, absolutely. I mean, let's find out. Because I knew you didn't get a definitive diagnosis until autopsy. And then I was also curious, how was the rest of him, given that he was 70 and what I had assumed was in otherwise perfect health. And by God, he was in otherwise perfect health. And they found both Lewy body and Alzheimer's equally extensively in his brain, which is highly unusual.
Wow. Yeah.
I know. And there was no family history, you said.
No family history. But interestingly, both his parents had neurological diseases. His father had MS and his mother had narcolepsy, and his sister has MS. So it just made me think that the family had a neurological weakness gene somehow that was manifesting itself differently. I don't know.
Yeah. Wow.
That's fascinating. It's fascinating to know that, then to have that information and maybe it puts some pieces together, like you said, the hallucinations and how that, because it's very hard to diagnose the Lewy bodies.
The last time we visited the neurologist at the memory clinic, I brought up the hallucinations. I said, so he's having hallucinations. What do you think about that? And the doctor said, well, do they bother him? And I said, well, no. And the doctor said, don't worry about it. And he didn't even put it in his notes.
Interesting.
And it was the first thing that the facility doctor said to me. She said, I think he's got Lewy body.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she was great.
Yeah, because I think that is a hallmark of Lewy body.
Yeah.
And a lot of times people have horrifying hallucinations, real scary stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah, he had those now and then, like war kind of thing. Because they, as when somebody's in a facility, they have to call if the person falls. And it wasn't this guy was falling, but he liked to spend a lot of time on the floor. So they had to call me. And that was when he'd have the war hallucinations. He was like crawling on the floor trying to avoid bullets and stuff. But that didn't happen very often. Usually it was he was traveling and then there would be times when the handyman and him came out and they'd find him on his hands and knees in somebody's bathroom and he was saying he was trying to fix the toilet.
Well, he was always trying to help. That's really great.
Well, and actually, after he died and I visited, I did a book thing with the staff, they told me he did this amazing thing. Well, first of all, his professional mediation skills were still there. He was mediating conflicts with the residents. But the other thing he did is that if he felt he really had a great empathy for people. If he felt a staff member was getting stressed out about something, he would walk up to them and stand next to them and turn to them and touch them lightly and say, "Are you okay? Can I help you?"
Wow.
And they were like, whoa, snapped him right out of whatever was going on. They felt they learned a lot from him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. I mean, it's interesting how the core of who we might be is going to show up in different ways, despite, whatever is coming our way, right?
Right. And this is a man who, had lost all his bodily functions. He was in diapers and had to be fed and all that other stuff. I mean, he was still writing almost up to a year before his death, when he was still at home and he was unable to dress himself and bathe himself. He was still writing.
Yeah.
It might take him 2 days to write 4 paragraphs, but he was still writing.
Yeah, I find that very interesting because we do have several authors in our organization who do have dementia and have written books, and some have written more than one, and some have traveled, quite extensively promoting their books and doing talks and stuff. And people have accused them of faking that they have dementia because they can't understand how you have dementia and write beautifully or speak beautifully.
Wow.
Right. No, it always amazed me.
Yeah.
But you lose that, especially people that have done it all their lives,
Right. And Sky hadn't, but like I say, he was, he'd had perfect scores on his SATs. He was just brilliant.
Smart.
And he said to me in one phone call, he said, they call me the professor here. I'm like, which hallucination is this? Well, they called him the professor because, as he said to me, he said, when we play those trivia games or those geography games, I have to keep my mouth shut because I know all the answers. And it was true. We were a big board and card game family, and we played until Sky really couldn't. And the final game that we could play was Trivial Pursuit because it didn't involve pieces and boards and counting. And, we would just ask questions and people would answer them. And he would always win.
That's right. That's fascinating. The brain. We know so little about the brain.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah.
We know so little about the brain.
Yeah.
We know so much more about the heart and other organs, sex organs.
Yeah.
But the brain, we don't. And there's just so many amazing things that people who have dementia can do. A lot of people discover that they can paint and draw and do work like that.
Yes.
And they've never done it before. And they produce outstanding stuff.
No, we went to a couple of conferences with the Dementia Action Alliance, and there were art exhibits at both of them, and the stuff was amazing. And the people had only taken it up after their diagnosis.
Yeah. I did want to ask, how was it for your 2 adult children nearing the end? Did they have time with him? Were they able to see him at all when he was in the facility?
Yes. They were able to come during those last 3 days. Unfortunately, every time my son came, Sky was unconscious. But our daughter was able. It was one of the times that it was actually the last time he was conscious when she was there. And Sky loved to sing. He was one of those people that had a song lyric for every occasion. And he was really big in changing lyrics. He said his father did this. And he and our daughter particularly did this together. They were long distance hikers together. They had done the long trail in Vermont. And so they were singing. And he was so weak, he could hardly speak. And they're just singing along, which was perfect, for her. And then she came after he died. And, we sat with him for several hours and talked and then packed up his stuff. And you had to bring all your own furniture to this memory care facility.
Wow. Okay.
We had a lot of packing to do.
I say, oh, wow. But on the other hand, it's like, that's actually could be very comforting, right? Something very familiar and very.
Right. And was it? Who knows?
Yeah, exactly.
Not like a hospital setting.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Sometimes these places are more for the family than for the residents,
Yeah.
How do your children feel about your book and your notoriety now and your award-winning place in all of this?
Well, the really fun part about that is that our daughter is a graphic designer and she designed the book.
Oh, gorgeous.
Yeah. And she's my technical expert. So she set up the blog and taught me how to do all that. And this is actually my 4th book. I'm the writer in the family. And the first one was with a major publisher. The 2 in the middle, I self-published. And Dana, our daughter, did the graphic design. And her best friend, Marisa, is a professional editor. And she had edited those 2 books. Well, she had just gotten hired by my publisher for Alzheimer's Canyon. So she edited Alzheimer's Canyon as well. So it was a real pleasure to be able to work with Dana and Marisa on the book. Yeah.
Very nice.
Yeah.
That is nice.
And our son, he's not, any of this is not interesting to him, but he embraced taking care of Sky, as a young adult male.
Yeah.
I think was a really big deal. We were a very close family. We homeschooled. And so the four of us really spent a lot of time together, more than most families.
Yeah.
And we'd always talked openly about everything. And I think it helped that I was a minister and a nurse. And, like the kids were at their grandparents' deaths. Like talking about death was a regular thing, like talking about sex. We talked about all of it.
It's a normal thing.
Yeah, they handled this very well.
Yeah.
And they both said, it's way better that Sky got dementia than you.
Oh, my.
Well, it's because Sky was a very laid back, kind of quiet guy, and I'm not.
Got it. And where did the title Alzheimer's Canyon come from?
That came from Sky's fantasy world. In the book, there are 11 episodes about this guy who finds himself in Alzheimer's Canyon, one way in and no way out. The detour off the highway that nobody asked to take. And so he wrote this fantasy story with this guy who ends up in Alzheimer's Canyon, who has many wild and crazy adventures.
Got it. That's wonderful.
That's where it came from, yeah. And reading them, after all was said and done, it's really like what happened.
Yeah. Very good.
So how did it come about that you actually finished the book and got it published? Where was he? Where did he leave it off?
I had written some, just sort of, this is what it's like for the partner kind of stuff. But, maybe once or twice a year, maybe. But once he was unable to write, I took up writing, and I wrote once a month, because our blog crowd, they wanted to know what was happening. So, and it was after he died, I thought this deserves to be a book. This deserves to go out into the larger world. And I didn't want to self-publish again. My two self-published books were for a very niche market. And they did well, the 1,000 copies, for their little thing. This is big. This is like everybody, 6 million people or more with dementia in the U.S. So I organized the blog posts and I wrote introductions to each year, and then I looked for a publisher and found one.
Excellent.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Did you want to read us something from the book?
Yeah, I'd love to hear. If you're ready.
Did you want?
Oh, we'd love it.
How much time do we have?
It's your time. Yeah.
Well, here's a couple little short ones that are kind of cute, funny.
Excellent.
They're called Store 1 and Store 2. Store 1. Alzheimer's, you are so slow. I can run circles around you if I want to. To prove it, I just drew a clock. Took 19 seconds, and it wasn't a bit difficult. Unlike at the store yesterday, $6.41. First, I hand over a 5 and a 1. I'd brought some change from home, so I dump a few coins on the counter. Quarters, nickels, dimes, and 2 pennies. Uh-oh. My mind gets seriously busy, jangling. Way too many possibilities, most of them skyrocketing over 41 cents. Others, not enough. The store clerk is patient, watching me pushing the coins around and around and around. Store 2. The Vermont State Liquor Store is a busy place this Friday afternoon in May. The colleges are winding down, the students are winding up, and the one liquor store in town is shaking. 20-somethings dominate the store, both behind the counter and in the long, polite lines of customers waiting to check out. The store is prepared for the onslaught with extra help at the checkouts. But there's one old guy, 2 or 3 times the age of everybody else. He's kind of disheveled, wearing work clothes. Despite his small purchase, he manages to hold up the line, emptying one of his pockets onto the counter. Why? Now the old guy is randomly sliding his pocket full of change across the counter at the clerk and muttering something. Homeless, maybe. Drunk, possibly. Or he could have escaped from his nursing home. Nope, just me in another cameo appearance as the demented one.
Oh my goodness. I love that he had such a
some humor.
Yes, sense of humor. I love that he had such a sense of humor.
And he was not what's the word? He has self-awareness, but he could laugh at himself.
Right.
You know, and wasn't afraid to make himself look foolish.
Right. As people who have read the book says, you will laugh and you will cry.
Yeah.
Right, because it's also very poignant as well. And he gets a lot across in a very short period of writing. Yeah. It's amazing.
So, Jane, what's next for you?
What's next for me? That's a very interesting question. What's next for me is that I'm moving to France.
Oh, my. Okay.
It was Scott and I always wanted to. We had this canal boat in France for 10 years, and we had thought about moving to France. Yeah. And we had actually looked for property and hadn't found anything in particular. And 2 years ago, I went to France to scatter some of his ashes in places that had been meaningful to us. And then I said to myself, oh, my God, you could move to France. It's just you. Like, your kids are grown up. They're responsible. They're fine. Like, I could move to France. And actually, I just got back from 2 weeks in France, and I bought a piece of property.
That's fantastic. How wonderful. What a great next chapter.
Yeah. And unfortunately, he was the one who was fluent and not me. I don't have the language gift that Sky had. So I am struggling with my French, but I can get by, sort of.
And they like you to speak French in France.
They do. And those waiters in Paris, they'll start speaking English as soon as I open my mouth. But I'm moving to a small city in the southwest of France where they're much nicer.
Yes.
So you'll have to let us know when you arrive so that we can change your status and we can say we have an author in France.
There you go.
Right.
They'll be the first French author.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. Will you continue anything in terms of advocating around Alzheimer's or dementia, or is that something that you want to maybe put on a shelf and pursue some other kinds of avenues? I mean, because Jane, it sounds to me like you're into everything. So this is like, you could go in a lot of directions.
I could. Well, I spent the last year from when the book was published in November of 2022 through May, public speaking around the country about bookstores, libraries, churches. And I got appointed to the Vermont Commission on Alzheimer's and Other Related Disorders. Mm-hmm. And I did a lot of advocating at the State House and gave the prayer one day and, whatever. And it's time for me.
Yeah.
It's time for me. And it was wonderful to do that. And then also, like, every week I get to talk about my husband dying. Hey, is this a lot of fun?
Well, there is that, right? So, gosh, I think moving to France sounds like a really wonderful segue in your life. Yeah.
So at this point, I'm not seeking out any public engagements, but if people approach me, I do them. And interestingly, a guy from Sky's class at Amherst, I had an audiobook made, and he listened to the audiobook, and he contacted me. He said, our class meets on Zoom once a month. Will you come and speak to our class? I'm going to do that next month. So that ought to be interesting.
Yeah.
They were like, we don't ever talk about death. We should talk about death. And I'm like, yeah, we're all like 73. Yes, you should talk about death.
That's what I'm always telling people. You need to start talking to your parents and know what they want. And you need to talk about, and you need to know what your plan is. Like, Don't wait till the last minute. But it's hard. It's hard for people. So, you know.
No, I know. I spent years being a chaplain in a little hospital, and there was more than once I'd be in that emergency room with somebody who was dead or dying, and families are like, what do we do?
Right. Well, I think that sounds really exciting and also very soul satisfying to go and do something fun and adventurous. And hey, your kids get to come to a cool place. You know, they've got a place in France to visit. There you go.
Sounds terrific.
Yeah.
Where can people find you on the internet and social media?
I have a website, janedwinell.com, and my other books are available there. And we lived in a tiny house for 2 years, and there's a blog about the tiny house. Anyway, yes, we did all kinds of stuff. And I'm on Facebook and Instagram, Jane Dwinell on Facebook and Jane for Care on Instagram.
I just followed you, Jane, so that's really exciting.
Okay.
I'm glad that you're on social, and that's great that people can find you.
Yeah. And where can people buy your book other than your website?
Buy it at their favorite independent bookstore. They can buy it from Amazon. They can buy it from me. Wherever they'd like to. They can ask their library to get a copy.
That's right.
That everybody can read it.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
And they can get it on through the Alzheimer, through the Alz Authors website too.
Great.
So that's terrific.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Yes. Thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to tell our listeners before we say goodbye?
No, I think we covered a lot now, didn't we?
Yeah, an hour goes a long way.
We did.
Yeah, it does. And now I'm going to have to go do my French lesson. Come on.
Yes. Au
Wow.
revoir.
Yeah, au revoir. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And really, I learned so much, and it was great to talk with you. And what a beautiful book. I look forward to reading it myself. So it's great. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me. That was fun.
Okay. Thank you for listening to Untangling Alzheimer's and Dementia, an Alz Authors podcast. For more details on this episode, please see the show notes. If you enjoyed the podcast, please leave a review and subscribe to it on whichever platform you use to listen to your favorite podcasts. For more information on Alz Authors, please visit alzauthors.com. While you're there, be sure to browse our online bookstore, where you will find hundreds of carefully vetted books on Alzheimer's and dementia. You can also find us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Please email your thoughts on the podcast to alzauthors@gmail.com. We are a 501c3 charitable organization, totally reliant on donations to do what we do. If our authors' stories move you, please consider contributing to our cause. Remember, you are not alone. One can sing a lonely song, but we chose to form a choir and create harmony.
My name is Andrea Kuchar, Alz Authors member and author of the memoir titled Embracing What Remains. I am excited to be one of the moderators of a new online book club collaborating with the wonderful organization Aging and Amazing. Every month, we will feature a book from the Alz Authors approved collection. At the end of the month, we will meet online and host a group discussion of the book, as well as invite the author to join us for a question and answer session. Please know it's not a requirement to have read the book to be a part of the discussion. Our goal is to simply share and open a conversation on a topic that is so important for the aging community. This is a wonderful opportunity to share our stories, connect with readers across the globe, and shine a little light on the effects of Alzheimer's and dementia in our families and communities. Alz Authors strives to help others through this journey and remind those on this path that they are not alone.
For more information, go to agingamazing.com or check out the show notes for this episode of Untangling Alzheimer's and Dementia. Thank you.